Welcome back to Letting Off Steam with the Discovery Center of Idaho. I'm Haley, and I'm your guide as we explore Titanic, the Artifact exhibition through the lens of science, technology, engineering, art, and math. Our topic is icebergs. This relates to the Titanic because that's what sunk the ship, and it's good to understand the environment in the world around you as it has impacts upon things like the Titanic. Now, how does this relate to steam? Well, we're understanding the properties of objects and materials on Earth, as well as the climate science that has to do with glaciers and icebergs. Now, the story of the iceberg that sank the Titanic started about 3,000 years ago. Snow fell upon the ice cap of Greenland, and the snow never melted. So over the next 50 years, it compressed into ice, and it became a glacier. Due to its enormous weight, the glacier flowed toward the sea, and when it reached it, it started breaking off into chunks and huge slabs, and one of these was Titanic's iceberg. And that iceberg made it from the Greenland coast all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean, which the site where the Titanic hit the iceberg is between Ireland and North America, and more specifically Newfoundland, which is in Canada. Now, most icebergs melt when they reach the ocean. Out of 15,000 to 30,000 icebergs produced yearly by the Greenland glacier, 1% of those icebergs actually make it to the ocean. Because the water is so warm, and I say warm because 34 degrees Fahrenheit isn't very warm to me, but when it reaches that ocean water, they only last a few months before they're completely melted. About 87% of icebergs is below the waterline. Now, no one really knows how big Titanic's iceberg was, but according to eyewitness reports, it could be as tall as 100 feet and as wide as 400 feet. I mean, there were huge chunks of ice that ended up on Titanic's upper deck. So it was pretty big. Let's see this in action. Today's objective is that you are going to understand that the majority of icebergs are below the waterline. What you're going to need to complete this simple activity is a ruler. You will need a balloon, and you are going to be filling it with water. That's why mine looks funny, but just any balloon. And you will need salt. Table salt does just fine. And a clear container full of water. I used this groovy science glassware because why not? But anything will do. A cup, a bowl, an aquarium. Step 1. You are going to fill your balloon with salt water. I used about a half of a tablespoon of salt to put in the balloon before, and then I added water to it. So it's pretty salty water. And then I tied it off, and then you will need to freeze that overnight in your freezer. So obviously I've already grabbed this from doing it yesterday, but that's an important step. So you'll want to make sure it freezes overnight. And this will be our iceberg. Put the iceberg in a glass filled with fresh water and observe. Whoa! So, how much of the iceberg is above the waterline and how much of it is below? So what we're going to do is we are going to take a ruler and measure how much of the iceberg is above that waterline. And of course, use your best guesstimation skills because we are using a ruler against a glass of water. So I notice that I've got about 1/4 of an inch of iceberg popping up above that waterline. And now if I were to measure below the waterline, let's flip it this way, about 1.5 inches. About 1.5 inches of that iceberg is below the water. So if you remember the statistic that 87% of an iceberg is below that waterline. So if I were just to do that guesstimation math, 87% of this iceberg is below the waterline. And you can just tell by listening to the inches that I read, right? So you got 1/4 of an inch. That's only, right, if you were to look here, 1/4 of an inch, and then 1.5 inches, right? And if you were, my challenge to you is to do that math and to check my work. Check and see if my 1/4 of an inch above the waterline compared to the 1.5 inches below the waterline, if that turns out to 87%. So for you math geeks out there, why don't you try that out and let us know. What did you learn today? You learned that the majority of icebergs are located below the surface of the water. And a bonus is that you understand the difference between glaciers and icebergs, which are an important difference. Thank you for joining the Discovery Center of Idaho in your journey of understanding the Titanic and the steam behind the scenes. Make sure to come check out Titanic the Artifact exhibition. The ticket link is below. And don't forget, stay curious.